Cable television, we're ready?
Yes, sir, we're ready.
Great. I'm calling to order this public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, November 3rd, 2022. The time is 12:55 in the afternoon. We're starting a little late because we had a hearing that just ended. The subject of this hearing is Bill 24-947, entitled the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022. This hearing is being conducted virtually. It is being broadcast live on Council Channel 13, on the Council's website, www.dccouncil.gov, the Chairman's website, www.chairmanmendelson.com/live, and it's also on the Office of Cable Television website, which is entertainment.dc.gov. As I said, the subject of this hearing is Bill 24-947, which was introduced by me and Councilmember Bonds on July 14th of this year. The purpose of Bill 24-947, again entitled the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022, is to require the Department of Buildings to establish a tiered proactive inspection program for multifamily rental housing properties. The tiers would be based on factors such as the number of housing code violations in the past 2 years, the average number of days housing code violations remained unabated at the property in the past 2 years, and the age of the property. The bill also establishes minimum inspection requirements, minimum and maximum fines and fees, and requires the department to prepare and submit an implementation plan and annual reports with specific program metrics. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, the record will close at 5 p.m. on Thursday, November 17th, 2022. We have 8 individuals who signed up to testify, and we will hear from them before we turn to the government. And they will all be let in now, and we will hear from them each in turn. Kathy Zeisel, who's supervising attorney at the Children's Law Center. Eleni Christidis, who is staff attorney at Legal Aid of DC. Caitlin Peter, who is vice president of government affairs at the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington. Luke Lanciano, who's representing Bernstein Properties. Dr. Janet Phoenix, who's an assistant professor at George Washington University. Nikita Katru, who is clinical manager, Impact DC, Children's National Hospital. Benjamin O'Hara, who is bilingual housing counselor at the Central American Resource Center. And William Washburn, who is a member of the NAACP DC chapter Environmental and Climate Justice Committee. The hearing notice said testimony is limited to 4 minutes. If you're in gallery view, you should be able to see the clock, and please be mindful of the time. Let me just check. Hold on a moment before I call the first witness. Sorry to keep you waiting, Ms. Zeisel, you want to begin?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Chairperson Mendelson and members of the council. My name is Kathy Zeisel. I'm a DC resident and a senior supervising attorney at Children's Law Center, which fights so every DC child can grow up with a stable family, good health, and a quality education. Children's Law Center thanks the council for creating the Department of Buildings and for taking this important step of establishing a quality proactive residential inspection program. As you know, there is an existing DC program, but it has not ever functioned particularly well. This bill contains many of the best practices of a PRI program, and our written testimony outlines some additional steps, and I'm going to outline some additional steps now in my oral testimony that we hope that the bill will consider. With respect to the tiers and classifications, we recommend instead of 1, 4, and 8 years that we consider 1, 3, and 5 years. In our experience, in 8 years, a building that had minor repairs can require major capital repairs, and we would hope that a PRI program would catch that before we get to that point. We also recommend that certain conditions should cause tier 1 and 2 properties to be reclassified ahead of schedule, including a threshold of health and safety violations as a result of complaint-based inspections, being put into a tenant receivership, failing HUD's REAC or getting certain scores on HUD's inspections, changing ownership, or other discretionary factors that the director could set. With relation to the building and unit selection criterion, we recommend that not all violations be weighted equally, that we look at which violations with that are life and safety violations be weighted more heavily in the algorithm to select buildings, and that we also use additional public health criteria to select buildings in addition to lead exposure, such as asthma rates and other markers of respiratory health, which have an evidence-based connection to housing conditions. To that end, we think that the new public health official should be helpful in setting these data requirements for the algorithm. We also recommend that unoccupied units be required to be included in the sampling. We often see landlords exclude these units from the sampling in order to, but these units often have some of the worst conditions and they're not required to be included. So they often don't come up when we see inspections happening. We also think that if certain conditions are found in the unit or common area, that should trigger inspection of neighboring units. And if a certain threshold is met, trigger an additional percentage of units to be inspected within the entire building so that we know the scope of the problem and what kinds of abatement or enforcement may be necessary in the building. It may even be necessary to inspect an entire building if certain conditions are found at a level in the building. With respect to tenant notice consent and in the building, we recommend that not just the landlord be providing consent, but the consents, we're concerned that unscrupulous landlords may evade this process by not collecting the consents. We would like that the Department of Buildings notify the tenants identified by mailing out consents, and also that the inspectors have the ability to receive the consents when they go out. In addition, we think that all tenants in the building should be notified that there is going to be an inspection so they can opt into the inspection if they want. We think that tenants who are inspected should receive a copy of the inspection report. It's been extremely hard for tenants to get copies of those reports historically, and that we ask that tenants should be notified along the way if anything is happening. We also make some recommendations about solving certain data problems that have been an issue and ensuring that the data is transparent both for oversight and research purposes related to the PRI program. Thank you for considering these recommendations, and we are, again, extremely happy that this bill is before the council.
Thank you, Ms. Eisel. Eleni Christidis.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, council members and staff. My name is Eleni Christidis. I'm a Ward 1 resident and senior staff attorney in the Housing Law Unit at Legal Aid of DC. Legal Aid has long advocated for codifying a proactive inspections program into law because of DCRA's well-documented failure to protect district renters from health and safety hazards in the home. We support passage of the Proactive Inspection Program Act, but we recommend amendments to the Act to ensure this program actually succeeds where DCRA has long failed. We support the use of a points-based tiered classification system, but it's important that health-related risk factors be given the greatest weight, along with demographic-related risk factors shown to correlate strongly with poor housing conditions. In addition to above-average lead blood levels in children, a higher rate of asthma in children is a strong indicator of unhealthy housing conditions. Above all, we believe the council must explicitly give these factors the greatest point weight to ensure that the classification of properties into tiers does not simply replicate biases inherent in a complaint-based inspections program. Second, we think 8 years is too long of a cycle for reinspection and not in line with other jurisdictions. We support a 1, 3, and 5-year reinspection cycle for each tier respectively, and believe the Act could say more about what would trigger reclassification of a property in between inspection cycles. Further, DOB should be required to report annually, not just whether, but why and how specific properties are reclassified. Third, unit sampling percentages should be a baseline, not a ceiling. Visual indicators of more pervasive problems, like a damaged roof, rodent infestation, or plumbing leak, should automatically trigger inspection of more units at the property likely to be affected, even if those units were not originally selected for inspection. Vacant units should also be inspected, as these units can harbor infestations or mold that spread to occupied units. DOB needs to treat tenants as key stakeholders and partners in this process. Tellingly, DOB did not list a single tenant group in its transition plan communication strategy. This is emblematic of an agency that sidelines tenants at every stage of the enforcement process. DOB needs to partner with grassroots community-based organizations already doing eviction diversion work on the ground with tenants. To maximize tenant participation, DOB should allow tenants to opt into inspections and give verbal consent for inspector to enter their unit, even if they have not provided a signed consent form in advance. DOB should also be required to provide inspection notice and consent forms in multiple languages as a matter of course. And due to the potentially more technical and sensitive nature of the inspections, DOB should use only its own inspectors, not contractors, to perform proactive inspections. The Act needs to add protections for tenants temporarily or permanently displaced by life-threatening housing code violations. Historically, DCRA has not done enough to ensure that landlords make repairs in these situations, which has led to tenant displacement. The Act should be amended to include daily fines for landlords who fail to correct uninhabitable conditions, to set aside funds to pay for tenants' temporary stays or permanent relocation costs, and to include property liens and business license revocation as a consequence for landlords who cause a tenant to be permanently displaced. Finally, the key metrics of the program need to be made easily accessible online so that researchers, advocates, and the public at large can evaluate if the program is meeting its goals and continue to make recommendations. Legal Aid genuinely hopes that passage of this act will shift DOB's housing code enforcement away from DCRA's track record of failure and toward an agency focused on enhancing tenant health, safety, and well-being. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Christides. Caitlin Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. My name is Catalin Peter. I serve as the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Apartment and Office Building Association's residential portfolio. Our members, who drive our trade association on a volunteer basis, currently manage nearly 105,000 units. Each of those units are subject to the proactive inspections program. I was relieved to see the council was examining the proactive inspections program. It's my understanding the bill before us, however, was drafted quite some time ago. That being said, while we have recommendations to improve the current program, we do not believe it is entirely necessary to dismember the program entirely. In the alternative, we would recommend melding the bill to create a tiered pilot program, as well as to make systematic improvements to the current program. First and foremost, we believe the current proactive inspection program must be restructured to prioritize inspection efforts on habitual housing code violators who have failed to abate conditions in a timely manner. My colleague Luke will go into detail about the current way notices of infraction are used versus notices of violation, and the need to give property managers a reasonable time for abatement through notices of violation, instead of going right to the notice of infraction. This shift would better reflect the landscape of housing providers who consistently do not abate violations. Right now, it also seems the current bill broadly penalizes all buildings to support a new tiered program. We want to work with staff to tailor the bill so that the entities that are responsible for violations are the ones that pay for the inspectors, rather than good building owners that keep their properties in compliance. Specifically, the percentage of required units to be inspected is exceedingly high, and the program, of course, will be funded in part by fees levied on all housing providers per the schedule. These costs can grow very quickly if you have multiple small unit buildings, garden style complexes, instead of one large multi-unit building. Again, we'd definitely like to work with committee staff on making a fair fee structure. I'd also like to note that the bill does not necessarily address issues that may be caused by tenants. So if there is a tenant caused issue that leads to a violation, we want to have a specific remedy for that as well. We understand that right now we are dealing with a very high cost to litigating certain infractions when a reasonable abatement period could provide a more expedited solution. My colleague Luke will also delve into that. Finally, more inspections without more staff is not necessarily going to create a more effective outcome. With DOB restructuring, they're going to need to build increased capacity with specifically more support staff. Overall, we see this as one of the biggest problems the agency has had with the current system and will continue to if they don't see additional staff. Overall, we see the bill as a jumping off point for some creativity in improving the current proactive inspections program to hold our grossest housing violators accountable. Providing safe, quality housing is the absolute priority for our members, and we're eager to improve the current communication process to be able to make repairs more expeditiously. If we can make some systematic improvements to ensure we have a reasonable abatement period, I'm confident you will see a majority of housing providers will respond in a responsible manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peter. And I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I don't have a copy of your statement.
You will receive a copy of our statement.
Thank you. And that applies to Mr. Lanciano as well. I don't have a copy of your statement.
Yes, we'll be submitting it.
Mr. Lanciano, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson and members of the council for allowing me to testify on the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022. My name is Luke Lanciano. I've worked for the past decade in residential property management with Bernstein Management Corporation. I've had years of experience with proactive inspections, first as a property manager on site, overseeing such inspections, and now I assist property managers in the field across our portfolio of such inspections. I'd like to emphasize that property management is a service industry. We have market incentives to ensure that residents receive prompt service as issues arise in their homes. Managing apartment buildings is no easy feat, especially when those buildings have been in continuous operation for many years. Our management and maintenance teams work daily to try to ensure that our residents are happy and satisfied. And to do so, we perform our own internal preventive maintenance inspections in all units twice a year to help aid in that goal. The bill before us appears to have the same goal we do, to ensure quality housing for district residents. My testimony today consists of recommendations to help the bill achieve that objective. First, I think it's imperative that the Department of Buildings improve their communication with property managers when residents report deficiencies so we can fix such issues promptly. The current process is broken. Code inspections requested by residents routinely occur without adequate communication ahead of time to property managers. Housing code inspectors compound those communication problems by solely issuing notices of infraction rather than notices of violation. A notice of violation is resolved through either the prompt abatement of a code issue or the issuance of a notice of infraction, while a notice of infraction is resolved through the Office of Administrative Hearings, and that's often a month-long process. This decision to change which notice was issued may have arisen because the department did not previously have a system to ensure that violations are abated. Their solution was to skip the step of the violation and move to the infraction. To the credit of the current team, they now have a process in place. And I believe that that's the most important goal of this particular program, is to ensure that issues that are identified are abated. Once an issue is abated, that should be the conclusion of the process. Unfortunately, even after abatement in the current process, we're stuck in a months-long process before the issue is finally adjudicated, which wastes time and resources. I urge the council to ensure code officials utilize the notice of violation process going forward to allow for timely abatement. Housing providers who promptly abate code issues should not be penalized at the same level as providers who fail to make such repairs. The bill must also allow adequate notice to housing providers of upcoming inspections to avoid bottlenecks for our staff. The current practice is to post schedules online with as little as 2 weeks notice, for property managers to prepare for an inspection that may involve dozens of units across larger buildings. This is too short of a notice period to inform tenants, to make sure staff is available, to double check to see if there are any issues outstanding. Through our own internal procedures, we find that residents often fail to inform us of issues in their homes, and that causes a lot of issues when there's an inspection, because we obviously would be happy to fix problems that are reported in a timely manner to us. The goal of the program is to move quickly, to identify issues, and to have them abated. And I think we share that goal. So I hope to certainly work forward on this legislation. I do want to note that we know from the most recent HUD report that there are some very poor conditions in city-run public housing, and that those units are in severe disrepair, but they do not appear to be subject to the same level of code enforcement as private buildings. Legislation like that being considered today should offer the thousands of Washingtonians living in public housing units the same protections afforded other renters in the city. I'm proud to work for a firm that is committed to maintaining the housing in their portfolio and can speak from experience that it is not an easy task. There are scheduling challenges with residents, supply chain issues for critical parts, as well as a range of other logistical issues in the pursuit of our goals. All buildings and building systems are subject to the forces of time and will slowly fall into disrepair unless they are maintained by staff. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, to offer my perspective, and would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lanciano. And again, we don't have a copy of your statement, which you will provide. Correct?
Correct.
Dr. Janet Phoenix.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Mendelson. Thanks to other members of the committee. I'm Janet Phoenix. I'm an assistant research professor at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. I previously served on CDC's Lead Advisory Committee and EPA's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, and I currently chair the DC Asthma Coalition and serve as a member of the executive committee of the DC Healthy Housing Collaborative. I am writing in general support of the concept of proactive rental inspection and many of the provisions that have been outlined so far in the bill. I have some specific suggestions that I hope you will consider as you move forward. The first is with regard to the frequency of the inspections. And I think whether you go with what's outlined currently, the 1, 4, and 8, or whether you adopt the 1, 3, and 5 that were recommended by Children's Law Center, that those need to be regarded as floors rather than ceilings, recognizing that there may be the need to inspect more frequently depending upon the conditions of the property. My second suggestion has to do with the criteria being used to assign properties to a tier. So there is a criteria of looking at elevated blood lead levels in an area to help determine whether to classify a property as needing perhaps more frequent inspections, and 5 micrograms per deciliter is the threshold that's being recommended. This is not consistent with what CDC is using as a threshold for elevated blood lead levels. They're using 3.5. And so it seems that the city should really be using the same threshold that CDC uses. Now, blood lead levels, I'm sure, were selected as a criteria because of the association between housing conditions such as chipping and peeling paint and lead poisoning in children. And there are similar associations between mold and pest infestations in childhood asthma. So as others have testified, I would also recommend including criteria about the percentage of children with asthma and or emergency room or hospitalization data, which is readily available through Children's National and will be soon available on a publicly facing database. The annual report that's referred to should really also include this health data about the number of units that were inspected and the disposition of those units in terms of elevated blood lead levels and asthma level criteria. I concur with recommendations from Children's Law Center that the public health official in the new Department of Buildings should be integral to incorporating health into the prioritization of housing units for inspection, and also looking at how data is communicated between agencies in order to facilitate making that happen. And I think that that this is an example of an area where coordination between agencies, the health agencies and environmental agencies that have this data, and the Department of Buildings, which needs to act on it, is important. It's not just a matter of having housing units where there are sick people living. It's the housing units that are making people sick. And therefore, this close coordination is really critical. I applaud the council for this legislation. It will certainly move us towards incorporating health into a housing framework. But in addition to that, we really need a working group that will meet with governmental and non-governmental stakeholders to look at other agency coordination that might be necessary to help this happen. Between a number of agencies. And so I've included as an appendix to my testimony some recommendations about the establishment of such a working group and who should sit on it. And lastly, I would support tenant notification of the inspection results as has been recommended by Children's Law Center. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Dr. Phoenix. Nikita Katru. I don't think I see you. Oh, you're here. Great.
Yes, I'm here. Hi, good morning, Chairman Mendelson and members of the committee. My name is Nikita Katru, and I'm the Clinical Research Manager for Impact DC, which stands for Improving Pediatric Asthma Care in the District of Columbia at Children's National Hospital. And so Children's National has been an integral part of the fabric of this region, serving DC's children and families. For over two decades, our Impact DC program, in partnership with the emergency department, outpatient health centers, and local federally qualified health centers, has been dedicated to improving asthma care and outcomes for children through clinical care, education, research, and advocacy. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of B24-947, the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022. So housing is a key social determinant of health. Substandard housing often suffers from deferred maintenance, which can result in significant environmental hazards associated with diseases like asthma. These conditions include pest infestations, plumbing and roof leaks causing water infiltration and mold, poor ventilation causing high humidity, and environmental tobacco smoke. The District of Columbia is a high-risk jurisdiction for housing-related health problems for two primary reasons: an older housing stock and a high poverty rate. Around 60% of the district's housing was built before 1950, and more than 80% was built before 1978. At Children's National, we recognize the relationship between poor housing conditions and health outcomes, and we are committed to improving conditions and health outcomes for children. With support from the Fannie Mae Innovation Challenge, Children's National brought together housing and medical experts to pilot a virtual home visit program in 2020 to identify and fix issues inside of our patients' homes that are contributing to asthma exacerbations and unhealthy housing conditions. And we actually continue to offer virtual home visits in our clinic to this day. So there exists a promising opportunity to leverage widespread access to technology to improve access to healthcare and quality housing. In recent years, Children's National has expanded telemedicine services offered to patients in their home direct to consumer using an app-based platform. The largest growth in direct to consumer, or DTC, has occurred in primary care to address chronic conditions, including asthma. They have the ability to have various parties participate in the same visit, regardless of their physical location, has greatly facilitated care coordination. We have continued to build upon our virtual home visit pilot by developing a healthy housing mapping tool. This web-based application displays housing violations from the former DCRA landlord violations dashboard. It displays pediatric asthma emergency utilization from Children's National, from our asthma registry, and other important property details such as ownership and use codes all in one place. Properties are assigned asthma morbidity values of low, medium, and high based on the rate of asthma emergency department visits per child with asthma identified at each property. We are excited to have launched this mapping tool for public use, and we believe this tool can be a resource to the proactive inspection program. Children's National supports B24-947 because it creates a system for healthier housing by proactively identifying and mitigating potentially unsafe housing conditions before a tenant can be exposed. While we are pleased that that legislation will require more frequent lead inspections and rental housing, which is critical to catching lead-based paint hazards before they harm children and lead to developmental or medical concerns, we ask that the committee consider adding a list of requirements to ensure asthma-friendly housing to reduce asthma morbidity. Our healthy housing mapping tool can support the Department of Buildings in addressing unhealthy housing conditions that contribute to asthma exacerbations. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on B24-947, and we look forward to finding ways to work collaboratively to support healthy housing for children and families in the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Ms. Katru.
Ketcher, yes.
Benjamin O'Hara. I believe he's not here. William Washburn.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and Councilmember Bonds. My name is William Washburn, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of the NAACP DC Environmental and Climate Justice Committee. I am proud to represent a coalition of environmental justice activists, both inside NAACP DC chapter and also with partner organizations that are committed to moving our most vulnerable DC communities from surviving to thriving. Environmental and climate justice is a civil rights issue. Injustices such as lead exposure and air pollution have disproportionately severe health impacts on lower income Black and Brown people in the District of Columbia. Lead and other environmental pollutants in our drinking water, our food, and the air entering our lungs require immediate legislative policy and budgetary actions to minimize these impacts. The NAACP advocates for environmental justice, clean energy, climate justice, and transportation equity, while advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion across the District of Columbia. We advocate for the policy, staffing, and fiscal resources needed to rectify these negative impacts and advance to a society where cooperative and regenerative communities uphold all rights for all people in harmony with the earth, our health, and well-being. The creation of DC Department of Buildings and the proposed enactment of the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022 together represent an opportunity to systematically address the challenges of polluted environments in and around many of the district's older apartment buildings, including those managed by the DC Housing Authority. Many of these properties present health risks to their occupants due to a variety of factors, including lead water lines, lead paint, and indoor pollutants from gas, heating, and kitchen appliances, mold, mildew, and pest infestations. A number of these properties are also located adjacent to high-volume traffic arteries such as I-95, I-295, Kenilworth Avenue, and Suitland Parkway that generate significant traffic-related air pollution in adjacent residential areas. We support the proposed Proactive Inspection Act in principle, particularly sections 3 and 6, because of their explicit focus on environmental justice for disadvantaged renters in the district. Section 3 with its proposal to have tiered inspections, and Section 6, which proposes penalties for instances of retaliation against tenants in a property, either as a result of a scheduled proactive inspection or as a result of a violation being reported by a tenant. Having said that, there are some issues and some recommendations we would like to make. One, it is unclear to what extent this bill will affect the properties that are managed and owned by DCHA, and we feel that those relationships need to be worked out. We also welcome the lead exposure standard that is proposed, but we would also advocate that a standard be imposed for air pollutants that can trigger asthma in children and other persons. And then finally, we would strongly advocate that that the bill's provisions be strengthened so that violations that are reported by tenants are covered by provisions within the act. These things we feel will help to strengthen the act and bring about regulatory environment that actually protects the health of residents in these properties. With that, I want to thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Washburn. And when I saw your name on the witness list, I said, that can't be the Bill Washburn that I've known for 40 years, but
It is.
it is. It's good to see you.
Same here.
I do have a few questions for some of the witnesses. Ms. Katru, in your testimony, you referred to a study done after the complete renovation of a formerly substandard multifamily housing complex, which showed significant improvements in childhood asthma. Can you say more about that study? Like when it was done or where it was done, or are you still here? All right, looks like we lost her. Or she left the witness table. Actually, I had another question for her too. Well, let me ask Dr. Phoenix, because you are a doctor. How readily available are some of these indices like asthma? The lead we think is fairly easy to get. What the legislation says is one of the factors to be considered in how often a building will be inspected proactively is if the property is located in an area where the percentage of children under the age of 6 have lead blood levels equal to or greater than a certain level. We think that's easy to obtain, but how about data regarding asthma or pest infestation or even mold? How easily available is that?
The project that Nikita Katru was referring to that was funded by Fannie Mae led to the creation of these housing maps. So there is an interactive mapping tool that will be publicly available and could be used by members of the new Department of Buildings. That includes data that will get you down to the neighborhood level. And that includes data about asthma morbidity. So the numbers of kids with asthma, the prevalence, but also emergency room utilization, hospitalization rates. So that data is available and could be used for this purpose.
Okay, so that mapping deals with asthma.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see. Legal aid in your testimony, you suggested near the end, there was a brief reference to removing the business license if the landlord's completely non-compliant. But doesn't that have a counterproductive effect, which is to say that it would never be exercised?
I think in my written testimony, that consequence was targeted specifically at when a tenant is permanently displaced. Because I think that's a really serious consequence to the tenant, and I would assume is indicative of a landlord that constructed an illegal unit, or a unit that for structural reasons could not be habitable.
You're reminding me. So when I looked at it, it spoke to removing the license for that unit, but I don't think a license is issued on a unit basis.
You're right, Chairman. That is a good point, and something I hadn't fleshed out.
Okay. I always like it when the witness says I'm right, even if it's not correct, but thank you. Ms. Peter, you talked about a fair fee structure. The fee structure here is $35 per unit with a maximum cumulative fee of $6,000 for any inspection cycle. So the building pays, if I read, my understanding is the building pays if it's being inspected. If it's not being inspected, it doesn't pay. If there are 100 units in the building, that's $3,500. If there are 200 units in the building, that's $6,000. Why is that not fair?
I think we want to examine the fee structure because the priority of the bill seems to be the grossest housing violators. So if you're not going through the process, or you have no housing violations or housing code violations, then we don't particularly understand why the fee structure would be the same across the board. It's something we want to examine with your staff more.
Okay, so if
we're not really clear on how it differentiates.
well, let me respond with this. So if a landlord has a slum property, they're going to get inspected every year. And let's just say they have enough units that they have to pay $6,000 every year. If a landlord doesn't have a lot of complaints, it gets inspected under the bill every 8 years. That means it'll pay $6,000 every 8 years.
I think one of the main issues that we have is that just because you're issued a housing code violation right now, or I'm sorry, you're issued a notice of infraction right now, if that process was altered to notices of violation and then infractions, I think it would make the landscape clearer on which housing providers are truly not abating conditions and they have outstanding notices of infractions versus notice of just the violation. I don't know if that's entirely clear. Basically, that if you could potentially have violations, however, you could abate them and you could be fined. And so you shouldn't be on the same level as if you have outstanding infractions where you haven't made any abatements to the properties.
Well, I think one can tell the difference between a building where the landlord is trying to be compliant and a building where the landlord isn't trying so hard, or even a building where the landlord doesn't care.
Right now, they're being treated equally.
No, well, yes and no. This is a proactive inspection program, and they're not being treated equally. The good landlord is getting inspected every 8 years, and the bad landlord's getting inspected every year.
I think our issues currently, you may have quote unquote good landlords who are put into the category of bad landlords versus quote unquote good landlords who may actually not be as good landlords. I think it's interesting that the other witnesses spoke about some of the most egregious violations versus violations that can be abated very quickly. I think that there's a big difference between especially some of the, whether it's mold or lead or asthma. I'm by no means a scientist, so I don't know exactly which one specifically. But I think we want to make sure that we're really getting to those violations, which are a health and safety hazard, versus those that can be abated more readily.
Well, that's a fair point, and that is something we will look at. But the number of violations over the past 2 years is just one of the factors to Bill cites. And I think that the the Department of Buildings would be given the latitude to come up with additional factors. And I think that may be where you want to focus, is the factors, whether the factors are sufficient to distinguish between the so-called good landlord and the not so good landlord. I
think that's fair.
The number of violations is an indicator, but it's not the only one. So I think that's really where the focus should be. But I did want to ask this, and I know I'm over my time, but I think I was given 5 minutes. Mr. Lanciano spoke to this, but you, Ms. Peter, just mentioned it. The way the NOI system is supposed to work is that the landlord is notified of a complaint. So this is the complaint-based inspections, not the proactive. The landlord's notified of a complaint, and the landlord is given so much time to fix it, and then the housing inspector comes out to see if it was fixed. If it wasn't fixed, then you get an NOI, not a whatever it's NOV. That seems kind of fair to me. Yes, Mr. Lanciano.
If I could respond. So the current process that DOB has in place and that DCRA had put in place is to not issue any notices of violation. Every single complaint it ends up as a notice of infraction. And they've developed it's a notice of infraction specific to the proactive program. So if we have a proactive inspection, somebody sees, a windowsill as a piece of chipped paint, like that is an NOI that is issued immediately. There's then a reinspection process, and between the issuance of the NOI and the reinspection process, you can prove abatement, but you're still sort of within that NOI process through the.
Well, if it's in the proactive program, we want to look at that, because the landlord's not given notice of the violation prior to being cited the NOI, if it's in the proactive inspection. But if it's in a complaint response inspection, you are given notice.
So we're not. We're just given a notice of infraction.
You're not notified. Wait a minute. So I call up DCRA and I say, God damn it, but the lights have been out in the hallways, all the common areas for the last 2 months. And Department of Buildings doesn't call you up and say, hey, we've got a complaint. We're going to come out here in 3 days.
So what we will occasionally get is an email that's like, there's an inspection scheduled at this building on this date. That email, like I just got one last week where it was a 77 unit building and they didn't provide the unit number. They didn't provide the issue that they were inspecting for. We had to do a bunch of digging with DOB, working up with the building staff. And we found out at the end of it, like the resident had just, requested a DCRA inspection before they had requested maintenance through our management office. We had fixed the issue already by that point. So we alerted DOB and they canceled the scheduled inspection. That was when we were lucky and we did get a notification. We've had, many issues especially the last 2 years, where we are not notified at all and we are just issued a notice of infraction several weeks after an inspection occurs. Nobody on site was aware that an issue was present, and that's sort of the brokenness, I think, of the process. Because if we're not responsive to a notice, like I fully appreciate that as being a bad property manager, you should not be doing that. But there needs to be like a basic notification level that can be guaranteed so that responses can be made. Like we just want to make the timely repairs. And if we can't make those timely repairs, then there should be the code enforcement process, but there needs to be proper notification.
Well, there was one other point you made, and then I'm going to turn to my colleague for questions. You said 2 weeks' notice is not enough with the proactive inspection program proposed in this bill. But why isn't it enough? If I remember correctly, I'm not quite sure you got to 2 weeks. I believe the bill says that the department, no, it does say 2 weeks, has to provide property owners with inspection consent forms at least 14 days prior to the inspection date. So you get 2 weeks notice. Why isn't that enough time?
So what, like for our larger buildings, we might be talking about 20, 30, 40 plus units, plus the common areas. What we typically do when a proactive inspection is scheduled is we make a first pass. We look at all the units, make sure that tenants who should have probably reported an issue to us, maybe they did not. We then fix whatever issues we find. Most commonly, it's paint issues. In older buildings, like you have to be extremely aggressive, making sure that paint hazards are abated properly. That can be a time-consuming process to find all of the issues, to schedule them appropriately with residents so that they're not inconvenienced, and then to do all of that within 2 weeks across 40 plus units can be extremely challenging, because we have to sort of work with our vendors, schedule them appropriately, and we also have sort of the day job, like the standard issue, like the toilet's not working, the lights aren't working, repairs. So if there is a system in place that selects buildings and schedules them, that schedule should be available earlier than 2 weeks ahead of time. So if it was available, say 2 months ahead of time, the end result should be the same. Like bad building owners who aren't responsive are going to get hit with violations, whereas good building owners who notice that their proactive inspection is coming due, they make sure all of the units are in good shape, they're not penalized as much. Like the end result would be the same. It would just be a slightly longer period to ensure that issues are resolved in time.
So this isn't just the common areas, you're talking about actually going into the units.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do have a couple more questions, but I'm going to turn to Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the public witnesses. Mr. Luciano, I just wanted to continue on with what you are discussing now and wondered, should the request for service or the complaint be specific to a particular unit? Let's say I'm a tenant, I call in and I say, oh, you need to come and inspect this entire building. Should it be that for the purpose of being accurate, that we limit it to a particular unit or a group of units that are specified in the complaint?
Well, I think the value of notification, it's not just to prepare for like the day of the inspection. I think the most important the value it has is like you know that there's an issue. So like if there's a common area problem and someone's like, you have to inspect this whole building because I don't know, maybe the lights aren't working or something. It would be good to know, like, at this building, someone reported that the lights in common areas are not working. We're going to come inspect on, this date. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to walk that building and make sure the lights are working. If they're not, we obviously need to fix them. We need to figure out like why nobody seemingly noticed that. That would obviously be a problem. But I think it's really important to get just the details of whatever the violation is so that responsible landlords can make the repairs as needed. I think that's very, very important. And if it's a tenant-based complaint in their particular unit, like it's important to know what unit it is, because if somebody tells me that there's a fridge issue at a building that has 100 units, I can't do anything. Like I just sort of sit and wait for the inspection to happen, maybe send out a mass email to all the residents asking like, is your fridge running? Like, what's going on? That's not a good process, because DOB should have that information. Like, it should be, available. So I would ask that they provide that to us so that we can make
All
repairs in a
right.
timely manner.
So I think what I'm hearing is, if the complaint is specific, then perhaps 2 weeks is a reasonable amount of time. If the complaint is universal for the entire property, you're suggesting that you would need more time. I'm trying to figure out this time piece, because it's very important. Because I'm also hearing, if I understand you correctly, that once you get a notice that an inspection is moving forward, you want to catch all of the problems before the inspection happens, if you can. And we want the problems to be caught. We want the quality of the living environment to improve. So the intention is not to levy a fine, but it is to get the quality of living improved. So I just wanted to make sure I understood that. That's why I was inquiring about the time. And I especially appreciate hearing from you, since you said that you are a residential property manager, decades of experience. And so that's really important. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to be clear as to what we were talking about. I also wanted to ask of you and Ms. Peter in particular, or all of our, I guess, our witnesses, what currently are the major defects that are encountered in the older buildings? There was reference to the buildings, 60% of the buildings being constructed since prior to 1950. So I just wondered, what are some of those really, because that's where we have to be concerned.
I mean, I can speak from our experience. Like, the majority of issues tend to be paint. Paint can chip, it can, degrade over time. If it's really close to a window and the window is left open, like that can cause water damage. If there's a steam or heating system near paint, just the temperature differential can cause paint disturbances near doors. I would say the majority of the issues we see are paint.
Paint, okay, paint chips.
And
Okay,
obviously we want to resolve that because of lead paint concerns.
okay.
And Councilmember Bonds, if I could just add to that, Kathy Zeisel from Children's Law Center, we also, to add to that statistic, what we find is that I think it's actually closer to 90% of the rental housing in wards 5, 7, and 8 are pre-1978. And that's kind of the magical year for lead paint. And so, as Mr. Lenciano highlighted, peeling paint and chipping paint is really a lead paint concern in those wards. And we see actually a lot of water and leakage issues related to needing roof repairs, plumbing issues. A lot of those buildings haven't had the major capital investment they need to sort of get the repairs updated. It's just sort of been minor investments over the years. And so now they need some bigger investments in some of the properties that we see. So we do see a lot of, when we talk about mold, it's often a shorthand for actually water intrusion related to roof leaks, windows that need to be replaced in the whole building, or plumbing that needs to be redone, as well as infestation issues related to mice, cockroaches, sometimes rats are pretty common. And those are major triggers for asthma exacerbations that we see. And we know that there's and Dr. Phoenix can speak to this as well, but we know there's a disproportionate level of asthma exacerbations that lead to hospitalizations and emergency room visits. I think last time we worked with Children's National on this, it's about 27 times higher in ward 7 and 8, or 7 times more likely for a child to go to the hospital in ward 7 or 8 than ward 3. And that's very much linked to the housing conditions we see there when we overlay that with mapping. So it's all linked together, all this healthy housing issues we see. And that's why this bill is so important, so that we're not just addressing it sporadically. We really need to address these conditions in a whole building. It doesn't help to just exterminating one tenant's unit. We need to really think about what a whole building needs to be repaired to have this healthy housing.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. We need to think about the whole building. I was just trying to narrow on this issue of timing, how much time you need and whether or not once you get the notice, you therefore go pronto to make the corrections, because that's what we want more than anything. And then we want to be able to inspect and say, aha, there have been corrections made. But this discussion leads me to really ask again of Aoba and you, Mr. Luciani, since you're responding to these issues. Is there a timeline that would suggest how long you expect a roof to last and the quality of the roofing? Same with windows, same with paint. Do you paint every 3 years? Those kinds of issues, I think, should be considered in whatever is our final document here.
Councilmember Bronze, I think that with regards to the two, right now, I feel like we're not getting those notices. Not only are we sometimes getting them vaguely, I think in general, we're having difficulties receiving any notices at all. I think often we hear about it after the fact. So I feel like that's the baseline. I think before we find, what's the magic number of when we should get notice, I think just getting notice in general, I think we're at the point where our property managers are finding out about inspections after they occur. And receiving and learning about notices of infraction after the fact. And that's not an efficient process. That's not giving them time to be able to abate these issues or to know about them or to even figure out, okay, well, this might take this amount of time to do. If it's this type of issue that was reported, it might take this amount of time. So I think trying to make all of those calculations based on, you have so many different issues that could arise. But
yes, and I understand that. I was really trying to move to, as we're thinking about how this bill can work for the entire community, thinking about what could we put in the bill that would be helpful to not just the housing providers, but also to the public, to tenants, to know that if I'm in a building and the rule of thumb is that the roof would be attended to or replaced approximately every 20 years. And when I move in, they tell me that the roof has been here for 40 years, then I can pretty much expect that there may be a greater need for inspections. And so I'm likely to call on a regular basis until I get, that water damage taken care of once and for all. So I'm just trying to explore how this legislation can really be helpful and not just another approach to when we talk about the tiered process, it concerns me. It concerns me because we're trying to think about the age of properties, but we also want to think about the age of the component parts of a property and how it would need to be replaced so that we would have a better idea as to what the law will really do, the relief that we'll get from implementing the law.
Well, and that's, I think, what I was trying to respond to Chairman Mendelson as far as the fee and the fine structure of this. Like, unless you have a landscape where you're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, it's going to potentially be disjointed. You may have certain properties who have a 40-year-old roof, and you may have one that it's very difficult to make this all, I think, line up on a perfectly tiered timeline or system.
Yeah, and we need that information to make the bill substantial so that it does something and so that the repairs are done and that the quality of living is improved and also improved in public housing I think there's a way that public housing units go through the same inspection process. I mean, that has to be our goal, citywide, so. That
Yeah,
was
no-
why I'm jumping in on this issue like this, because it's so important. It really, truly is.
And just on a point for the building components like a roof or windows, I mean, we have some rules of thumb we use, but I think it's important to note like all building systems, they just need to be maintained properly and installed properly. I mean, for a good roof, like 40 years is a rough metric, but that doesn't mean 40 years with no issues. There might be, a bad rainstorm or a bad windstorm that impacts parts of the roof, and you just need to address those sort of piecemeal. So I think there's definitely value in ensuring that, those folks who have a roof that desperately needs help on like the western corner, if units below that are facing water intrusion, that should be a reasonable cost that, a landlord would have to pay to repair that section of roof. Like you can definitely do roof repairs sort of in a piecemeal manner. And, windows, it's all about the ceiling around the windows. That's again, relatively straightforward to do. Sometimes grout issues on brick buildings are more challenging because it can be tough to figure out where the source of a water intrusion is. And it could be quite expensive to do repointing on a whole building facade. But those are some rules of thumb that we typically use. There's like an IRS depreciation schedule that we use when we do our CapEx planning.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'm way over my time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. So I have one follow-up question. Maybe more for Ms. Zizell. And I see Ms. Christidi seems to have left. So the Department of Buildings says they already have a proactive inspection program. I went on their website, did a proactive inspection at no cost. All units must be inspected. In September, they presumably inspected 60 properties. In October, they inspected presumably 41 properties. Why isn't the current program good enough? Why do we need this bill?
Thank you for asking, Chairman. I mean, it's one of those areas that, as you know, we have testified at oversight many times at DCRA. It's one of those areas where my understanding is they've had 4 contract inspectors doing it for many years. We've never been able to get data about what's happened with any of those inspections, if there's ever been enforcement, what actually happens with proactive inspections. They worked with Georgetown a number of years ago to develop an algorithm, but there's been it was a secret algorithm in terms of how they figured out what properties that they were doing. And as far as we can tell, the selection of properties doesn't seem to match to where we think there's the greatest need. I think similar to the concerns Ayova has raised, it doesn't seem to be getting to where the most problem properties are. And it doesn't seem to be following best practices as we understand in proactive inspections programs should follow. And we recognize that Department of Buildings budget has a lot more inspectors in it. And we think that's important that we, at this point, really help define what that program looks like so that it can be successful. We noted in our Children's Law Center testimony, similar to what Ayova noted, we need to fix the garden style apartment problem that we've long had in DC. So we're not just inspecting tax lots, we're inspecting complexes. So we understand what's going on with an entire complex and really can get to the root of an issue of an entire complex and not random parts of it. I mean, there's a lot, this legislation has the potential to solve a lot of the problems so that the proactive inspection program can be the cornerstone of strategic enforcement and voluntary compliance like it should be if it worked properly. Instead, it's been kind of a throwaway side program in DC that we have no idea how it's worked over the years, essentially, because we've never really been able to get any meaningful data or information about it.
And I think you have, and I thank you for that point, because I think we have members like Luke and others who are doing everything they humanly can with a seemingly random program, and then the building owners where we probably should be getting at them, don't seem to be having their issues resolved. And I don't really know what the answer is. I think we'd all like to work together to maybe have further conversations about this to see how we could really get, and I'd be curious just on more health data, because I feel like everything I've heard is there are some very specific health issues that we are trying to eradicate, and there are things that could lead us there and let us know where those and why they're occurring, and perhaps shifting the focus of not to change the proactive inspection program, but to get at the most serious issues that are affecting properties, and not just private owned, but also the public housing properties.
Thank you. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony. You all are excused. Hold on, actually, you all are excused. You can continue to watch, and I'm going to ask that the acting director of the Department of Buildings, and we also have somebody from the Attorney General's office, that they both come now.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, council
Good
members,
afternoon.
staff.
Give me a second before you start.
Okay.
All right, we have Monique Cobb, who's Assistant Attorney General in the Office of the Attorney General, and then Ernest Charapa, who's the Acting Director of the Department of Buildings. Ms. Cobb, you want to go first?
Sure, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, council members, staff, and residents of the district. My name is Monique Cobb, and I have the privilege of serving as an Assistant Attorney General in the Office of the Attorney General's Social Justice Section of the Public Advocacy Division. Personally, I'm born and raised in DC and have a background in federal and local housing enforcement. The Office of the Attorney General strongly supports Bill 24-947, the Proactive Inspection Program of 2022. This important bill will ensure that the newly created Department of Buildings will have an effective proactive inspection program, which is critical to ensuring safe housing for the district's most at-risk residents. Over the years, OAG has made it a priority to use a law to preserve affordable housing and to protect the district's most at-risk tenants. As part of OAG's focus on protecting tenants, OAG aggressively enforces the Tenant Receivership Act, the Consumer Protection Procedures Act, the Lead Paint Act, the Nuisance Abatement Act, and the DC Human Rights Act, which together protect tenants from civil rights and housing violations. This bill will help to support this work by ensuring reliable and effective enforcement of the district's housing code. Implementation of an effective proactive inspection program is critical to ensuring rental housing is habitable and safe, particularly in underserved communities. Proactive inspection plans are more effective than complaint-based inspection systems because many of the tenants in at-risk communities do not complain about unsafe housing conditions. Moreover, although DCRA established a proactive inspection plan, neither the plan nor its implementation has effectively addressed housing code violations. This bill will increase the effectiveness of the newly created Department of Buildings inspections as it codifies a robust strategic plan for proactively inspecting properties, increases transparency, provides an at-risk algorithm to target properties and focus resources, and creates an enforcement scheme that will help to deter potential bad actors from not maintaining their properties. OAG, however, recommends several changes to the bill to ensure it is effective at protecting the most at-risk communities. First, the proactive inspection program should be designed to ensure public resources are focused on wards 5, 7, and 8, because these wards have the highest poverty rates and tenants within these communities are less likely to make complaints about their housing conditions. Next, as it pertains to the tier analysis, OAG recommends that properties in tier 1 be inspected every 5 years as opposed to 8 years, as 8 years is too infrequent. And the bill should also be more specific to how properties are placed within each tier and should include considerations such as the severity of violations and whether property owners have a basic business license. The program should also prioritize buildings whose owners have a history of noncompliance, because these owners may have multiple properties that are not in violation with the housing code, as as was the case with Sanford Capital. The bill requires currently that proactive inspections include a certain percentage of units depending on the size of the building, but these provisions should also include requirements that include a diversity of units to assess a property's true condition. The bill should also be modified to clearly include a requirement that vacant properties be included in the proactive inspection plan, as these properties could harbor nuisances that create health and safety issues. The bill should also require that some proactive inspections be conducted without advance notice to owners, to not allow the owner the opportunity to make patchwork repairs before the inspection. And lastly, because OAG plays a critical role in enforcement, OAG should be included in any reporting to the council. Thank you for holding this hearing on this important bill. OAG strongly supports Bill 24-947 and looks forward to working with the council and the Department of Buildings to ensure effective and fair enforcement of the district's housing code to provide safe housing to the district's residents. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cobb. Mr. Chapa.
Good afternoon, Chairman,
Good afternoon.
council members and staff. I am Ernest Trapper, Acting Director of the Department of Buildings, and I'm here today to provide testimony on B24-947, the Proactive Inspection Program Act of 2022. The bill establishes a new tier proactive inspection program for rental housing properties that has a different program and reporting requirement than DOB's existing tier proactive rental inspection program. I appreciate the work done by Chairman Mendelson and Councilmember Barnes in crafting this very detailed proposal, and we are in agreement on the need to periodically re-examine opportunities for improvement in protecting DC tenants. As we understand it, the underlying rationale for this legislation is that the current DOB proactive rental inspection program does not adequately target resources to properties with vulnerable populations or properties with a history of code violations, which is not exactly accurate. I would therefore like to use this opportunity to share with the council and members of the public how the proactive inspection program works, highlight concerns we have with the bill in its current form, and offer suggestions on how we can partner with the council to combine the best aspects of the existing and proposed programs to arrive at an optimal solution for district residents. From the inception of the proactive rental inspection program in 2005 until 2020, the selection of housing providers and units for inspection were on a random, non-scientific basis. However, in 2020, as part of our pursuit of continuous improvement, we reformed the program into a data-driven approach by adopting a risk-based model that correctly predicted violations at an address level with an accuracy rate of approximately 90%. Currently, the DOB Proactive Inspection Program framework is designed to routinely evaluate properties for code compliance on a frequency based on risk level. The program ensures all district properties with 3 or more rental units in the District of Columbia are inspected on a cyclical basis. Properties with 3 or more rental units are automatically enrolled in a program and are subject to proactive inspections and the associated fee. To determine the frequency of inspections, the proactive inspection program uses a specialized algorithm that was developed in partnership with Georgetown University to identify rental properties with an increased likelihood of code violations, some of which include vulnerable populations to the extent that vulnerable populations live in buildings with a history of code violations. The algorithm is a logistic regression model that considers factors such as a building's age, property type, property age, ward location, complaint-based inspections, license status, and the landlord's history of code violations. This allows DOB to more effectively deploy our inspectors to the highest risk buildings before conditions deteriorate further and become increasingly hazardous for residents. Each property is identified based upon the algorithm selection process across all 8 wards. Properties may also be selected for a proactive inspection if DOB receives a significant number of inspection requests from building tenants. The majority of properties identified by the algorithm end up having 1 or more violations. Our targeted system using the algorithm has been in place since the spring of 2020, and it has successfully identified district properties with the highest probability of violations, allowing DOB's personnel to target the worst landlords. The current risk-based approach is a logical method for conducting inspections and taking enforcement actions by issuing notices of infractions, NOIs, compared to any previous approach. For example, in fiscal year 22, we conducted 11,398 inspections and issued 1,332 NOIs, the highest number compared to any previous year. Proactive inspections occur depending on the risk score of the property, but additional inspections may be scheduled in response to property maintenance complaints. Under the Proactive Inspections Program, the DOB website lists the property scheduled for an inspection by the 15th of each month prior to the month of the scheduled inspection. The schedule may be found online at dob.dc.gov. A notification letter is also mailed to the landlord, and the property is posted with a proactive inspection notice 1 week prior to the scheduled inspection. Data concerning the results of proactive inspections is also regularly updated on DOB's agency dashboard for public awareness and accountability. At DOB, we believe in a proactive inspections model based on science, which was arrived at through engagement with district residents and our Georgetown University partners. We believe the current constructs provides value in objectively identifying multifamily properties that are most likely to have a violation and is equitable for landlords that maintain their properties. Given that the agency already has a proactive inspections program in place, which targets high-risk properties, it will be helpful to have a better understanding of what problem this bill is trying to solve, or what can be made more robust in the existing program. Ideally, we would have preferred to work with council during the drafting process to provide more information about our existing proactive inspection program and the lessons learned over the past 2 years in utilizing this risk-based algorithm, and work together to take those lessons and improve the existing program instead of creating a new program out of whole cloth. A suggestion for the council is for DOB to develop another model based on the 9 factors identified in the bill, such as solid waste violations, stop work orders, failure to pay property taxes, etc., and evaluate the performance of such a model before adoption. Best practice in the scientific community calls for predictive models to be evaluated on the accuracy of their classification, what type of misclassification occurs, error rate, and misclassification cost. DOB remains open to such a dialogue and finding a nexus between what the department is already doing and the intent of this legislative proposal. I would now like to turn to some significant concerns we have with this bill as proposed. First, the legislation establishes new definitions that are both over-inclusive and under-inclusive, and thereby create confusion with existing definitions. For example, dwelling unit and rooming unit are separately defined in the code. Dwelling unit includes rooms for living, sleeping, and eating, and preparing meals. By contrast, rooming unit includes rooms for living and sleeping, but not for the preparation or eating of meals. To cover both types of units, the existing proactive fee provision is defined as applying to rental accommodations of 3 units or more. By using the generic unit in the existing proactive fee provision, it covers rental accommodations that have 3 or more dwelling units or rooming units. Here, the bill specifies dwelling units only, thereby potentially omitting rental properties comprised of rooming units. Additionally, multifamily as defined in the bill includes single-family homes and duplexes. So under this proposal, no type of rental property in the district will be excluded from the program. Moreover, the legislation defines multifamily rental property in a wordy and confusing manner, whereas the existing proactive fee provision simply describes inclusion in the program as rental accommodations of 3 units or more. Unless there is something lacking in the current definitions, we urge the council to utilize the existing definitions in the code and existing proactive fee provision to reduce confusion amongst participants and also reduce challenges by property owners regarding coverage of the program. Next, I would like to discuss the tier system that this bill creates. According to the legislation, properties in Tier 1 shall be proactively inspected every 8 years. Properties in Tier 2 shall be proactively inspected every 4 years, and properties in Tier 3 shall be proactively inspected every year. However, a concern here is that the proposed 3-tier structure is not a weighted system. Some housing code violations are, of course, more severe than others. For example, there's a significant difference between a no water violation and a windows violation on any given property. The seriousness of each type of individual violation should be taken into account under any type of tier proactive inspection system. This would also require front-end work by DOB to craft regulations prior to implementation. On a similar note, the proposed system based on raw number of violations is somewhat flawed because it does not take into account the total number of building units. To make the tier system effectively operational, there will need to be a pro rata or pro capita calculation to effectively identify high-risk buildings based on the number of units with violations. Another issue is that the legislation requires consideration of factors for which ready data may not exist. For example, we can all agree on the importance of utilizing data on foreign-born, English as a second language, and low-income district tenants as a factor in the proactive inspection program. However, this data may not readily exist or exist in the exact defined categories. Collecting data on these demographics will need to be worked out with our sister agencies who serve those communities. We would also need to evaluate if the demographic factors actually improve the predictive power of the model and arrive at a fiscal impact statement prior to implementation. Again, we would welcome the opportunity to work with council on making adjustments to this bill that would allow the district to leverage existing data. The final point I'd like to make regarding the tiered approach is that categorizing every rental housing property in a district into 3 tiers would require a very significant amount of resources. The location-specific factors enumerated in the bill will take a significant amount of data to implement as described in the bill. For example, people with disabilities, people who use English as a second language, and lead blood levels in children equal to or greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter. At this point, it is not possible to know how many properties will fall into each tier. That is not to say that it is impossible to calculate this, but I want to highlight at this preliminary stage that it would pose a significant administrative challenge and that much of the work on this will need to be done in advance to arrive at an accurate fiscal impact. Another concern DOB has is that the bill does not provide any resources to drive the enforcement process after an inspection and re-inspection is done. Mandating increased inspections requires additional resources beyond those needed to conduct inspections on the tail end. For example, it takes resources to process notice of infractions, litigate the violations, and to abate violations where appropriate. Without properly addressing the increased amount of infractions that will be issued, and that will inevitably be appealed to the Office of Administrative Hearings, it is difficult to understand how this bill will have any teeth. Our next concern pertains to penetration rates, which refers to the number of units inspected versus the total number of units in the rental accommodation. Under this bill, there is no change in penetration rates based on buildings tier or risk category. Penetration rates can, of course, vary widely depending on the availability of landlords and tenants, inspection refusals, and the effectiveness of notice. This is an area for further dialogue on how best to meet proactive inspection goals, particularly since work would be needed to determine how many properties fall under each tier. Next, We find the retaliation prohibition enforcement language in this bill to be concerning. The bill states that housing providers shall not take any retaliatory actions against tenants or occupants due to any findings of proactive inspections. While we support the bill's intent, it will require significant resources on our end. Investigators will now be needed to interview tenants and landlords, complete investigations within 15 days of receiving a complaint. Violations will have to be served and litigated at OAH, and extensive program support will be required in addition to just having inspectors identify and sanction bad actors. Turning now to the fiscal impact if enacted, this proposal would require considerably more staff than the existing count of 80 full-time and contract inspectors and other staff funded in fiscal year 23 to implement the TS system, as it would require a significant amount of manual work, much of which is currently performed through an automated process. Generally speaking, this proposal will have a significant fiscal impact, both due to the new staffing and programming demands. Obviously, council controls the purse strings, but I want to note this upfront and highlight that it will take some time, even after this proposal is adopted, for DOB to arrive at a phase working with the Executive Office of the Mayor to determine the implementation cost. We would like to have a further discussion on council's anticipated timeline and how we can provide support to arrive at an accurate phase. Chairman Mendelson and members of the council, thank you for the opportunity to testify, share more details about existing proactive inspection program, and provide feedback on this bill. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Director. I'm going to start with NOIs versus NOVs. So you made the point, I think around page 6, 7 of your statement, that there will be enforcement challenges, and right now you're issuing notices of infraction, which means that a fine is due. But you used to issue notices of violation, which was like a notice that you fix this violation or there will be an NOI. It seems to me that there's a trade-off here. If a landlord is given advance notice, for instance, for the complaint-based inspections, if I remember correctly, you notify the landlord that they've gotten a complaint, you've gotten a complaint, the landlord has an opportunity to fix it, and then you send an inspector out, and if they haven't fixed it, you fine them. With the proactive inspection, particularly since there was one witness who testified that some of the proactive inspections should be unannounced, but even if they aren't, because it's not specific as to a violation, why not do the NOV system and then followed by the NOI, a notice of violation followed by a notice of infraction? And wouldn't that make the enforcement challenge easier? You're muted.
Sorry about that. One day somebody will have to develop this bot that would automatically detect your lip movement and unmute. Your question about NOV and NOI is understood. And I'd like to explain how the process works so that for the public or others who are also listening, they can have a better understanding. In 2019, we did a study, and what we found out was that the NOV process, as it had been in place at that time, was really not effective in accelerating repair rates. Over 10,000 violations that were looked at and thousands of inspections, we found that repair rate was only at 30%. The NOI process over the years has provided an abatement and repair rate as high as 53% as of last year. So the NOI process is superior to the NOV process in terms of like incentivizing abatement repair and getting to the outcomes that we like. With regard to notice on the proactive inspections, housing providers and landlords are made aware at least 15 days in advance of the inspection, the units that will be involved, the common areas. at the time of inspection, if a violation remains unaddressed, while we issue an NOI, there is still time for the landlord to address the underlying violation before we file the NOI in court. Once we issue the NOI, they get at least 15 calendar days if the NOI was served electronically, and 20 calendar days if it was served by mail. So let's look at the window now that a landlord has to actually fix an issue. At least 15 days before the inspection, they are made aware of what will be inspected. After the inspection, they get 15 calendar days before we file the NOI in court.
Is that in a rule? Is that a written rule? Or is that just your policy?
I'll have to double check, but that's been the practice. And the 20 calendar days is actually required in the Civil Infractions Act when notices are served by mail. I have to double check, but that's something that is already in place. And then
you're saying the Civil Infractions Act says that you have to wait 20 calendar days before you can file it.
That's correct. So with all this lead time, even when the issue is addressed, we offer landlords a settlement opportunity because we are interested in compliance and we are not motivated by the fines. The money doesn't come to us. I think those who act in good faith end up getting a fair shake, because at the end of the day, if you fix the violation, it is better for us to settle that fine than to have our attorneys sit in court for hours litigating issues that are not, emergency issues.
What about this is off subject, but the representative from Bernstein said that they rarely get notice of a tenant complaint of a housing violation. So they get issued an NOI when you come out. I thought you notify the landlord.
You are correct, Chairman. We do notify the landlord. In fact, step one of our process explicitly ask the tenant, have you notified the landlord? Because the landlord has rights that must be respected. If the tenant says no, we tell the tenant, your first point of call is the landlord. Now,
wait a minute, that wasn't the notice I meant, notice from you. So Mendelson calls DCRA and says, my landlord is, I have, my plumbing's not working. Do you notify? I thought in the past you've said you notify the landlord, but the representative from Bernstein said no, they rarely don't get notice.
that's not accurate. We have thousands of records that show notifications to landlords. In fact, we track that because we know from experience that when we get to Office of Administrative Hearings, they ask us for proof of notification. So we are able to pull it up where we can even tell the date and time when the landlord was notified, the operating system of the computer they are even using, and their response, because sometimes some housing providers respond to the notice and say, we've actually addressed the issue. And then we confirm with the tenant. And if it's been resolved, we cancel the inspection. So I know from practice that landlords are notified of these inspections and these complaints prior to the inspection actually occurring.
Well, he says they're not notified. So would you talk to him?
Absolutely. I'll make sure somebody on my staff speaks with him. And we've done that many times with a bunch of landlords. So that's something that we can easily handle.
Okay, well, I sort of like to see that resolved. Where do I have some questions here? Your criticism of the current bill starts off by criticizing some definitions, but dwelling unit and rooming unit are not defined terms in the code. I mean, excuse me, in the bill. They're not defined in the bill. So I'm not quite sure why we're being criticized for those definitions. So I'm confused by your criticism.
Based on how the bill is written, it would require us to inspect all rental units, regardless of whether it is one family, two family, three family, and above. So this is flagging an issue for council to clarify intent. Is council looking for us to inspect 3 units and more? Or is council looking for us to inspect single family and 2 family units as part of the proactive inspection program? Because as it's currently written, it specifies dwelling units only, which would also omit rental properties comprised of our rooming units. So there are 2 issues there.
Well, multifamily rental housing property means residential real property consisting of 3 or more dwelling units that are rented or offered for rent. So that defines the universe of what gets inspected. And then it says the number of individual units inspected in a multifamily housing property shall be calculated as follows. At least 75% of units in a property with 25 units or less. So I don't understand why your testimony starts out, first, the legislation establishes new definitions that are both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. For example, dwelling unit and rooming unit are separately defined in the code, but they're not in the bill. And then you go through a discussion of each. By using the generic unit in the existing proactive fee provision, it covers rental accommodations that have 3 or more dwelling units or rooming units. Well, that's not correct. Because the bill pertains to multifamily properties with 3 or more dwelling units. Also, the way this bill is written, it leaves a lot to you in terms of rulemaking. So I looked at this more carefully in light of the testimony. We probably should add a paragraph that says that you can add factors, but you are free to, through rulemaking, decide that the level 1 housing code violation will be treated differently than a level 2 housing code violation. You have that flexibility, but you would have to do that through rulemaking. I'm not sure what else. Am I making sense what I'm saying?
I hear you. On the practical level, the ability to operationalize or clarify certain aspects through rulemaking is incredibly helpful. So I appreciate your confirmation of that. Based on my understanding prior to this hearing, the definition of multifamily in the bill includes single-family homes and duplexes under the proposal. So that is very different from the scope of the current proactive program. The current proactive program does not target single-family units, single-family dwellings, and 2-family dwellings.
Give me a second.
Okay.
trying to sort this out, but it's 3 or more dwelling units.
Yeah, I think it's a drafting issue that can be resolved because
Yes.
if you look at line 36, line 38, it
Yes,
says a single family home or duplex.
yes. I've checked with the author.
Okay.
If a single family house is divided into apartments, so it's meant to be 3 or more dwelling units. But I get what you're saying. I hope you get what I'm saying. In any event, the factors, there's room for, I think we need to clarify that there's room for you to add factors. But with what we have here, there's room for you through rulemaking to make some of them more important than others.
That will be particularly helpful as we want to use models that have a high confidence rate, a high likelihood of identifying properties or addresses with violations. And we want to base adoption of a model on science. So I appreciate you clarifying the flexibility for us to add factors and also address other issues through rulemaking.
I'm over my time, but I'm going to ask one more question and then turn to my colleague. You talk about in the beginning of your testimony, in 2020, DCRE reformed the program into a data-driven approach by adopting a risk-based model that correctly predicted violations in an address at an address level with an accuracy rate of 90%. Can you say more about how you determined the model fit for your current algorithm? You went to Georgetown, but that only tells me you went to Georgetown. What about the specific factors?
The specific factors in the algorithm include the location, the property type. Is it an apartment? Is it a rooming house? It also, these are just a few examples. It also looks at the age. It also looks at history of complaints and abatement. It also looks at the license status, whether the license has expired, the license is active, the license is ready to be renewed, because the science showed a high correlation of those factors to violation rates. So for example, if you take property characteristics such as location, in the analysis with our work with Georgetown, what we saw was that properties in Ward 8 have a violation rate that is close to 45% compared to properties in Ward 3 that had a violation rate close to 12% compared to properties in Ward 7 that had a violation rate about 32%. So there's something about a location that gives you an insight to a property's risk level. And this allows us to target our resources effectively. So that's just an example of how a particular characteristic influences the algorithm.
Yes, and your statement says, when it says location, it says ward location. So the bill is more specific. If I remember correctly, it uses the word neighborhood or area as opposed to ward. So there can be areas in Ward 7 that have multifamily apartment buildings with fewer violations than other areas in Ward 7. And the bill says area, and the algorithm you're using is based on ward. That's how I'm understanding it.
That's correct. But at the end of the day, the predictor is location.
Well, yeah, but there's a difference between Deanwood and Hillcrest.
I get that, Chairman. At the end of the day, it comes down to the model's predictive accuracy. One factor in itself is not the sole determinant of the risk level we associate with
Sure.
the property.
Well,
And
what does accuracy mean?
accuracy means, think of this, you are predicting that there's going to be a violation at 1100 4th Street. If your accuracy is 90%, it means 90% of the time, when you say there's going to be a violation at 1100 4th Street, there is in fact a violation.
Well, I can bet, and I mean no disrespect here, I can bet that there's a violation at 1100 4th Street. I don't think you can go into any building without finding a violation. So that's why I'm asking, what do you mean by accuracy?
Accuracy is overall, literally like the overall accuracy of the model by looking at location, property age characteristics, and incidence of violations above what people say the mean. Like whenever you do an inspection, we know that statistically, half of the time we will find an issue. But if the issue is discovered 90% of the time when there is an inspection, that is in simplistic terms, a higher risk property.
So it's finding a violation or finding a bunch of violations?
There has to be at least one violation. The number of violations will vary per property. You may go into one unit and there are 5 violations, but there may be some common area violations as well. You may go into another unit, there are 2 violations. So that's what we mean by violations. It varies based off our unit, but at an overall level, you want to be able to feel confident that you are catching issues before they worsen. And you are doing it in a way that is scientific, it is objective, and doesn't introduce any element of discrimination or bias.
All right, I'm so over my time, and Councilmember Bonds is going to want to go over her time, and I have a few more questions. Councilmember Bonds, please don't look at how much I went over the clock.
10 minutes and 37 seconds. But I'm not going to ask for that amount of time, although we probably could go on for hours. And how are you, Ms. Cobb? Glad to have you here as well. 100%. Ms. Cobb, I wanted to start with you to just let you know, I agree that 8 years is a mighty long time, because water damage happens over a period of months. And not nearly a decade. So I'm where you are, and at least in fact, I think every 4 years would make a lot of sense. But you know, those are just numbers. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to look at the legislation a little differently. And thank you very much for that comment. I also wanted to know, and unfortunately, I missed part of your testimony, so I may not have it here, but I wanted to know, as it relates to the complaints and the housing properties that the OAG has looked at, how serious is the issue of owners, managers offering residential housing for rent that is not in compliance? How serious is that? Is that like out of 10 units, 7 tend to have some issue that they're not in compliance with DC housing laws, or is it more like just maybe 2 out of 10?
I just want to clarify your question. Are you speaking of certain communities or the properties that we are enforcing against?
I'm speaking of, yes, the properties that you're enforcing against, the properties that you get complaints. I'm sure you get calls from the public wanting your office to look at properties because there's this strong feeling that there are violations there, and that the housing providers have not been responsive.
I think that's a question that varies. Sometimes we get complaints that are where there's a few violations. And then I'll say sometimes we get complaints and, you know, it's substantiated that the entire property is in a truly bad condition. We have seen those. Yeah, I think it's hard to answer that question just because it varies in terms of how many units out of a certain units. I think, you know, as we recommended in our testimony, sometimes it depends on the owners. You know, certain owners are unlikely to maintain their entire properties, maintain their entire DC portfolios or their properties in their DC portfolio. So I think that's a hard kind of question to answer. We can't give exact units, but we can, you know, give like, we do get hundreds of complaints per year based on housing code violations.
Okay, so as we look at this legislation and we know that we are looking at it more of good versus so-called bad, should we also factor in those that through your office have been identified as bad actors and make sure that we do regular inspections? That would be those regular once a year inspections, just to keep them moving forward and making sure that all of the units are brought into compliance and the common areas brought into compliance, and it stays that way into at least for 5 years or so.
I think that's a great recommendation. I did hear someone testify to putting properties of owners who OAG has brought suit against in tier, I believe it was tier 3, for more inspections. I do agree with that proposal. And I think that that is a pretty fair way to address some of the housing conditions issues, because there are patterns with owners across their portfolios.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Shapler, what I want to try and understand, you were talking about the current proactive methodology that you use versus this sort of random selection process that we're proposing in the bill. And so you're saying, if I'm reading it correctly, that you already have a system that identifies with an accuracy of 90%. Did I read that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so you feel that trying to make an improvement over that doesn't get us where we need to be, in that we want to make sure that all of our properties are safe, sanitary environments. So maybe we don't need to think about the random process. Am I correct? And is that what your testimony is telling us?
What I'm saying is the current model for identifying risky properties or properties where landlords are not holding the end of the bargain with our tenants and the city when it comes to safety is robust. If I can run a process and identify violations with a 90% accuracy, if somebody has a different process, that process has to have a higher accuracy rate, number one, before we should switch to that our model. That's what I'm effectively saying. What I'm also saying is that some of the factors that will be required under the bill, such as the environmental hazards, stop work order, may not necessarily be strong predictors until it is actually tested. The other thing I'm saying is, if we are going to be focused on repair rates or addressing housing code violations, we should look beyond the inspection process, because enforcement takes resources other than inspectors. It takes resources to litigate those violations at the Office of Administrative Hearings. It takes resources to coordinate the inspections. It takes resources to confirm and validate abatement. Those are areas for improvement based on how the bill is currently structured. But we welcome the opportunity to work with council in making sure that any new thing we come up with can be implemented and it actually helps.
Okay, so do you see this bill as written being a way to raise the revenue that would be necessary to keep the inspection process going and to address some of the abatement issues?
Yes and a no. Yes, in one area. It takes the current cap of $2,000 to $6,000. So yes, that increases the revenue ceiling. No, because it doesn't, at least based on how it's written, show how the additional revenue will be used for abatement. And when it comes to repairing violations, the property owner is responsible. Having the city become the repairman, while it may be necessary for life safety issues, is not ideal for routine property maintenance issues.
Well, I mentioned the not ideal situation because in some instances that have been brought to my attention, the property owner does not have the resources to make the necessary repairs. And so usually the repairs are then indirectly long-term shifted to the tenants with the increase in rent, et cetera. And so I was just wondering if how you saw that and whether or not there is room within this legislation to think about that fund that we have talked about many times for rental housing, and that's that little amount, but a big amount for many, that would be necessary for making repairs and keeping the property up to a high standard.
I agree with you. With that in mind, yes, I think, at least from where I sit, there's room to provide suggestions on how some fund can be established to support property owners who want to do the right thing, but sometimes there's just not capital available for them to make the appropriate investments. While there are market-based approaches, the government might be able to help. I know our partners at, I think DHCD have like grant programs. But again, if we look at this in terms of the government stepping in to provide some seed investment or some capital for people to repair the housing stock, then that makes sense.
Okay, so this is, outside baseball, but the every 2-year fee that landlords or housing providers pay for every unit of rental housing that comes into your shop or did come into your shop, DCRA, that is not enough. I think it's finally at what, $25? I tried to make it a little higher at one time, and because it's been stuck at around $25 for 18 years. And to me, I think it could be a little more robust, and then we would have at least some monies to do some of these things that we know we need to do, particularly when people are living in very extreme situations, so that we don't always have to go to receivership, to the courts, but let's take care of immediate needs more quickly.
Yes, you're right. The fee structure, $35 per unit with a cap of $2,000. If that changes, yes, it would provide more revenue for the nuisance abatement fund, and that can be used to address some of these conditions. But I would also like to share that given the state of our housing stock and the current economic conditions, we need to look deeply into what the impact of any fee will be for business owners and property owners. The vast majority are small landlords. In fact, if you look at the distribution of rental units in terms of multifamily, two-family, and single-family, the vast majority of our units are within the single-family category. So for a very small landlord or an individual, a slight fee increase can have severe consequences, but sometimes it's necessary. So I just share that to offer both perspectives that, yes, I support the idea of additional funding for abatement, but I'm also sensitive to the impact of fee increases to our small business community and individuals who are doing the very best they can to support our city's housing needs.
Thank you very much. And I'm clocking at 3 minutes and 22 seconds, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. That's because you're a very good council member. So let me, I'm going to do a little bit more on this. What the regression model that the Department of Buildings is using versus this bill. So I'm looking at your testimony. The factors are building's age, but also property age. Isn't that the same thing?
Yes, that's the same thing.
And property type, which I can't think really makes a difference. You can have a slumlord who has a garden apartment, and a slumlord who's got a 4-unit building, or a slumlord who has a 100-unit high-rise. So I'm not quite sure why property type is relevant. Ward location, which, as I said before, there are neighborhoods within wards that are quite different. And in fact, for the lead-based factor that we have in the bill, we were thinking of like census tract, which is certainly not a ward. Then you have complaint-based inspections, which is similar to some of the factors we have, number of housing code violations found at the property. Then you have license status. I'm not getting that one because either you have a license or you don't have a license. And unless you mean what kind of license, although I think for multifamily, it's pretty much the same license. But if you don't have a license, I'm not quite sure it shows up in your, would show up in your formula. And the landlord's history of code violations, which is sort of similar to complaint-based inspections, a little different. So I'm not quite getting all that. And I'm still having a problem with accuracy. Accuracy of what? We said that earlier, that there's going to be a violation in the building, or that it's going to be a slum property as opposed to a luxury high-rise.
All right, Chairman, if I may, I would like to use a different scenario to explain the algorithm in general, and then I'll bring it back home. Let's take credit scoring as an example. It is a predictor of risk, whether somebody is creditworthy or will pay bills. And it is generally understood, even though there are some areas for improvement in that. The algorithm takes an address and several other factors and comes up with a score.
A credit score, to use your analogy.
Yes, the higher the score, the more likely you would find violations when you get into the unit or the address. It goes up to like 90-something%. So if I have a property that scores 97, and I have another property that scores 20, I am more likely to find violations at the property that scored in the 90s than the 30s. So keeping it simple. Property type, it turns out, is a predictor of violations. That's the science. For example, properties that are classified as apartment buildings or apartments in general have a violation rate slightly above 50% compared to a property type like a two-family rental, where the violation rate is less than 10%, compared to a cooperative association, where the violation rate is close to 15%. So that is the science. It looks at property type and says, this is what matters. And the reason it is crucial to a model's predictive strength is that you really don't want to be wasting time on variables that don't have any predictive value. Let's take location as an example also. Based on the analysis that we did with our partners at Georgetown, we saw that the violation rate varies based on the geography, in this case, ward. So that tells us ward is an important factor. In statistics or data mining, they call it the strength of the coefficient, meaning if I have to pick two things from a universe of factors to predict an issue, I'll definitely pick property type, and I'll pick license type, because guess what? The data shows license type also plays a role. If you have a license that has expired, that tells us something. If you have a license that is ready for renewal, but you've not taken action, that tells us something. That is, in sort of like broad strokes, why we've identified factors and we are sticking with factors that have a predictive value. The sum of taking all those factors into consideration is a model that 90% of the time, if there's going to be a violation, it would tell you.
You know, what's going through my mind right now is how many witnesses came in and felt that the program is missing the mark, that it's not keeping after the slum properties. But let's do this. We're going to follow up probably with an email to you that will ask in more particularity than I'm capable of for more explanation with regard to your algorithm so that we can understand this better.
Sure.
I have a couple more questions. In your testimony, one of the criticisms of the bill is that the proposed system is based on raw number of violations, which does not take into account the total number of building units. But I would say again that that's left to rulemaking. In fact, all we say is the number of housing code violations. And I think there's a lot of flexibility there. I would hope that rather than our trying to be more specific, we would leave that flexibility, because then you can weight one class of violations greater than another class of violations, and that you also could weight possibly, I say this with some hesitance, possibly the ratio of violations to number of units. I'm going to keep moving here. In your written statement, you also criticize, without properly addressing the increased amount of infractions that will be issued and that will inevitably be appealed, it's difficult to understand how this bill will have any teeth. But if this is a flaw, it would help if you could suggest how we address the amount of infractions.
Sure, we'll take time once it's appropriate, to talk through the fiscal impact and what it's going to take to get to the abatement of violations and strengthening the enforcement cycle. Because I've said on the record many times, we are one cog in the larger wheel, and there are other factors involved: OAH, OAG, Superior Court, the existing laws that we have, and there is an opportunity to strengthen those areas in addition to providing, yes, personnel that can handle these litigations. So when it comes to the fiscal impact, we'll think through broadly how to make this program more effective. But some of the comments that were made earlier on are really not factual. For example, the idea that nothing comes out of proactive inspections is not accurate. Every inspection that we do, we provide the results in our data systems that is accessible from the public. For example, our agency dashboard. And I find it heartwarming that one of the people who testified earlier said they are even using the landlord violations tool in some of the mapping programs they are created. So that sort of shows the dissonance. Somebody is saying we have access to DCRA data or DOB data that we are using for our tools, and others are saying nothing comes out of the inspection or proactive inspection process. You can simply go to our website, type an address, and you see the outcome of the inspection. There's no magic to it. It's just transparency. Information is made available. So again, there's misconceptions. And I think hearings like this, Chairman, that you put together helps address those misconceptions.
Give me just a second. Well, if you could provide more suggestion, that would be helpful. You also said in your statement, our next concern pertains to penetration rates, which refers to the number of units inspected versus the total number of units in the rental accommodation. Under this bill, there's no change in penetration rate based on the building tier or risk category. Well, yes and no. So if the property has 25 units or less, it's 75% are going to be inspected under this bill, at least 75%. And that's true whether it's tier 1, 2, or 3, which I think is your criticism. But you're going to, if it's tier 1, you're going to be inspecting those 75% of units every year. And if it's tier 3, as the bill's written, it'll be every 8 years. So there is a difference in the penetration, in the frequency of penetration, which is a form of penetration. Am I missing something there?
Let's put it this way. Under the current proactive inspections program, our target is always 100%.
Yes.
Unless the tenant refuses, that's a goal. Anything that falls short of 100% is not good enough in terms of getting at the issues.
Well, this bill allows you to be 100%. It says at least 75%.
It shouldn't say at least. It shouldn't, because it is watering down a higher threshold. Like, what is the value in saying at least 75% when the existing is 100%?
That the system is sufficiently overwhelmed that we don't want to require 100%. If you can do 100%, great. But based on the testimony we get, it feels like the system is overwhelmed.
The system is not overwhelmed. It's their lack of understanding of the system, because the system uses risk to target 100% versus 100% of the entire population. Like, I want to keep things simple so it doesn't sound complicated. You identify risk and you focus 100% on the risk versus what people will call the naive model, right? You try to achieve some artificial penetration rates that is not driven by data or science. So from that construct, I feel keeping the bar at 100% makes sense because it is risk informed versus watering it down to 75% and hoping for a better outcome. From my experience,
But you know,
inspection-
Director, not to spend too much time on this, but every year at budget time, you tell me that your budget, it meets all of your needs, 100% of your needs. And this year we increased the number of inspectors by, I believe it was 60%, effective October 1st, because I have a strong belief that you don't have enough inspectors. And if we compare you to, let's say, Baltimore, I think you're still probably about 80 inspectors short. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend you have enough inspectors. And you have to deal with complaint-based inspections. And I don't hear testimony at these hearings that you're on top of all these complaint-based inspections. And now you're going to proactively inspect every unit in the city, which you haven't been able to do. So if you want to do 100%, this bill allows you to do it, and I'd say go at it, but I don't see how you can really do that and inspect every unit in the city under the timetable in this bill, which I think is less aggressive than the timetable that you've sometimes spoken of. I just don't see how you can do it unless we increase the number of inspections. So I don't know. The point here is that you said that there was no variation in penetration rate based on the tier, and I'm saying there is. The variation is by frequency. I'll keep moving.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to respond to this, Chairman, because I get your point that, yes, the bill establishes different tiers, and that provides the agency flexibility under the proposed model. I'm comparing it to the existing model, which is purely risk-based and targets 100% penetration. And that leads to better outcomes and model accuracy. So there's something to be said about that. People can make comments about the complaint inspection process and inspections, but at the end of the day, being able to achieve 53% abatement rate last year was not by accident. It's because of deliberate policies and investments that the mayor and the council have made in the agency to support our program. So we are definitely doing a better job protecting tenants, but there's more work to be done. And that is why I welcome the opportunity with council to collaborate on solving these intractable problems.
I think maybe I will quit at that. Councilor Bonds, did I incentivize you with another question?
No, thank you, Chairman. I'm good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Ms. Cobb, please don't take offense. I didn't ask you any questions. Your testimony was very helpful. It also was very supportive. And you had some suggestions in there, as did Mr. Trupp. We'll look at all of that. I do want to note, there's a possibility that we're going to try to get this before the council this year. So if there's a fiscal impact analysis that Mr. Trupp you want to do, you should be doing it now.
We'll do our best. Our partners at our OCFO would also have to do their part as well in getting to that number. Ultimately, they approve the fiscal impact. We come up with estimates based off our understanding. But yes, we will do the work that we need to do to at least have some initial baselines. Yes. What it's going to take.
Okay, just remember that if the fiscal impact comes out and it says you need another 80 inspectors to do this bill, that actually kind of tells me that you need 80 more inspectors, which is a point that I made a few minutes ago. I put the hearing notice somewhere. I'm going to wind down this hearing. Again, thank you to each of you for your testimony, and thank you to the previous witnesses for their testimony. This has been a hearing on Bill 24-947, which would establish in the law a proactive inspection program for the Department of Buildings for rental housing in the District of Columbia. The record in this matter will be open for 2 weeks. That is, it will close at 5 p.m. on Thursday, November 17th. The time is 3:20 in the afternoon. I'm going to adjourn in 10 seconds, and we will have another hearing to follow, which will probably start in 10 minutes. Thank you. And at 3:20, this hearing's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.